Okay, as we continue a little bit more with the openness view, page 93, for the open view of God, top paragraph, God's knowledge of the temporal world, which we inhabit and which inhabits us, is also temporal. God experiences things as they happen, and God's knowledge of events develops as events take place. Yeah. So, I do like how he develops this on 94 and 95. Now, there is this God responds to the world, God cares for it, middle paragraph 94. God can act within it, and God will ultimately redeem it. So, the openness model, as Rice goes on to say in this very paragraph, is predicated on God being love, that God is love. So for open theology, as for various other theological perspectives, love is not just one among several divine qualities. It identifies the very nature of God. God's very essence is to love. 1 John 4:8, also verse 16. God's innermost reality is a triune fellowship of love, and love characterizes all that God does. God's original decision to create and God's unconditional commitment to the objects of divine creation, to the world and to all its inhabitants. Of course, this all just makes all the more problematic the problem of evil. Again, God is love. God cares about the world, and then you have this thing, God will ultimately redeem it. And I've raised this question, maybe not with Richard Rice, but Clark Pinnock, the guy that he mentions in the footnote. I've heard him speak a couple times, and once very specifically on open theology, open theism. And I have a great deal of sympathy for this position, but it is interesting that in the end, as Rice is saying, God will ultimately redeem it. So at some point, it would no longer be open, right? The openness is about the contingency of creaturely agency decisions, but not all decisions, just the fact that we're bodies in a material world and we move around. We create waves of influence and change things, and other things change us. And the openness model says that God, now does God restrict God's capacity to know the future? No, I don't think that the openness model says that. I think it's more that this idea that the future really is what God knows perfectly. Okay, we'll put it that way. Then if we say, and the future is not like that single film strip with all the events, the future is actually a vast, extremely vast panoply of possibilities. And you could say, like, in principle, unpredictable, just because you just start thinking about all the creatures on the planet, not just humans, but we'll even say mostly humans, that that any event could go this way rather than that way. Any meeting might take place or might not have taken place. And yes, you could go with the idea that God engineers all that, but the openness model is not for that. It's for something far more, open-ended. But when it comes to eschatology and that God will ultimately redeem the world, it appears that the openness model is proposing that at some point God will either tire of or despair of this openness of creation with all of its possibilities, both for good and or ill, and clamp down on it, have a happy ending, and so on. At which point we could go, okay, if God's going to do that, shouldn't God have done it by now? I mean, like, how much suffering do we have to do? why has God created such a world in which the future really is rife with virtually infinite possibilities, and then stop it at some point? What would have been the point to have started it? And then maybe you can appeal to soul-making theodicy or something like that. In other words, these aren't airtight, of course, these are not airtight approaches to the problem of evil. But that's always been one of my problems. It's interesting that at the bottom of 94, that bottom paragraph, Rice opens it. The opening chapter of the Bible paints a highly interactive picture of God's relation to the world. God creates in perfect freedom, da-da-da-da-da. Furthermore, interesting language, God exercises complete control over the creative process. Complete control. The world owes its existence entirely to divine activity, fully responsive to God's creative power. God speaks and creation does God's bidding. The interesting thing is, and I learned this from Brother Dr. Kelly because I asked, in Genesis 1, and we may have talked about this in class before, it is worth mentioning again. I think that Rice could have better sold the openness position here by noting that when God speaks in Genesis 1, it isn't commands. God isn't making commands that creation then has to obey. The let there be this, let there be that is it's called the jussive voice, I'm told, Jussive, and the jussive voice clearly is not a command. It is more of it's this. It's let there be. It's an invitation. I like the language of invitation. It is true that at every step, creation is described as responding positively to the invitation, but that's a little different than God speaks and creation does God's bidding. In the sense that, again, it isn't simply like God commanding or speaking things into existence. And this becomes even clearer when you have the language of let the land, which is better than earth there as a translation, let the land bring forth, fruits or plants or whatever it says. And there's even a play on words in the Hebrew, at least some scholars think, that where the terms for producing plants or fruit is a little bit like if we were to say in English, let the land produce produce. Okay, that one's obviously an identical term being used as a verb and a noun, but in the Hebrew you get something like that. I think it's like tasha desha. Now you can't load a lot of theological freight on this. The key thing is that God invites, creation responds, and then God sees that it's good. God doesn't command it to be good, nor does God simply decree it to be good. God saw that it was good. So God issues the invitation, the creation responds fittingly, God sees that it's good. So you have actually something more like an open model happening there. What would really make it openness is if, the creation didn't respond to the divine invitation. And in some ways, it seems that Gregory Boyd's cosmic conflict model finally does suggest that. Maybe not in Genesis 1, but sometime early on in the creative process, there is a spiritual rebellion that begins to introduce these elements, destructive elements, into God's otherwise beautiful and perfect world. Boy, it'd be a tough position to sustain, and I'm thinking more and more that it might be fun to see if I can get Gregory Boyd to talk with us. We're acquaintances, so he's not a friend by any means, but not that I wouldn't like that. But we've certainly interacted some ways over the past. In fact, I have a limerick about him that I shared in the video that I lost. I'll probably share the printed versions of a couple limericks this time when I post this stuff. Okay, so where are we? So in other words, the let there be is a much more openness type of thing. Suffering in the openness of God. Open Theism, page 98, affirms that suffering is not part of God's will for us. Ooh, almost out of time on this one. When we suffer, there's nothing to be gained by trying to find a specific divine purpose or reason for it. But we can learn from our sufferings, it says on page 99. And certainly in this, and he goes on to say, God, while not knowing all the future in detail, I think even an openness model would say that God probably has a really good idea about most future things. And even if they're not dictated or even perfectly known by God, certainly the idea here would be that God, as the God who is love, works within the stream of the world's time and our creaturely time in a variety of ways to try to bring about good. And he quotes, I'm pretty sure he quotes Romans 8 here somewhere where you get that idea. It's worth noting, while I'm on that, he quotes it on page 99. Okay, go ahead. My honey's going to go by here in a minute. And, okay. So, one thing I was going to say is that in Romans 8, the good that I'm convinced that the good that all things work together for to those who love God is the good of becoming Christ-like, because we read there that God's whole intention is that we be conformed to the image of his Son. So again, not claiming that God either dictates or even particularly allows these harsh realities. The promise that we'd be relying on is that God is faithful to work through all these circumstances for those who are willing to be molded, right? To those who love God, to mold us increasingly in the image of Christ. And I come back and do one more on the openness model.